Power is dangerous. It is corruptive. Those who wield authority and influence without due care will all too easily fall victim to pride, greed, and every other self-centered vice. This is a universally true principle that applies across every gender, race, and other categorization of peoples that you could imagine. The modern world doesn't seem to understand this fact. Modern Hollywood outright ignores it and acts as if seizing power is synonymous with heroism, which could hardly be further from the truth. And of course, the current generation of filmmakers have a, shall we say, rather strong tendency to write a leading lady whose main focus is herself, her self-actualization, and her own power. You might wonder why this has happened. You might be wondering why it matters. Lucky for you, dear viewer, I have answers. Hollywood has historically been dominated by men. In this, it resembles, well, practically every other industry and profession. And since filmmakers were largely men, they tended to make stories for men. Women were usually side characters or love interests, often without a ton of agency. Obviously, there are plenty of exceptions, but those do not disprove the historical trend. I mean, the leading lady in one of the most beloved movies of all time is just kind of there. I will love The Princess Bride to the end of my days, don't get me wrong, but it would have been nice if Buttercup had just a little more gumption. It would have been better for the story if she had been somewhat less helpless and not quite as much of a giant wimp whose entire contribution to the whole quest is this one stick. But I would hardly want to change her character entirely. The worst thing you could do to Buttercup would be to have her reject Wesley along with Humperdinck, swear off marriage entirely, declare that she can run the kingdom on her own, thank you very much, and then ride off into the sunset alone. Does that sound familiar? It should. This idiotic character that I dreamt up by rubbing together my last 2 remaining brain cells bears a striking resemblance to any number of so-called heroines from the past decade. However, I've already made a video explaining why such characters are generally reviled by their audiences, so today I'm going to mostly focus on one particular aspect that is often present in those stories, whether explicitly a part of the character arc, or more implicitly as a motivation for their existence in the first place or some changes made to their character. And that aspect, as you may have guessed, is power. So, what is power? Put simply, it is the ability to enact change. Those who hold and wield it can shape themselves, their situations, and even other people to fit their designs, to the point where those with immense power can change the course of a society or an entire fictional world. As I said a minute ago, this makes power incredibly dangerous. The powerful man or woman is in grave danger of being corrupted by the authority that he or she holds. And the more power one has, the stronger the corruptive pull. But Hollywood doesn't acknowledge that. For the most part, they seem to believe that women having more power is good. And that can mean they write fictional heroines who are inherently powerful and seemingly unstoppable, or it could mean simply having a more equitable share of women in leading roles in popular and thus influential franchises. And those aren't inherently bad things, but they also aren't inherently good. They're just things. Whether they will be good or bad depends on how the creators use them. Your impervious, nearly all-powerful heroine does not need to be self-centered and obnoxious and have a character arc flatter than the state of Kansas. Although I don't really care for Superman as a character because I find him boring due to his sheer power level, I at least acknowledge that the big blue Boy Scout must be given some credit for his desire to simply help others, not prop up his own ego. And while I think that striving for a 50-50 split between male and female heroes in the MCU or in any franchise is pointless chasing of a mostly meaningless number, I wouldn't give half a cabbage cart if the characters were written with the same attention and care as Tony Stark in the first Iron Man movie. Wait, Tony Stark? The dude who built an armored flight suit so he could play at being a hero? That's the guy you're going with as an example of how power is dangerous? Yes. Because if that question I just mockingly asked myself is how you view Tony, you need to look up the meaning of character growth. Tony Stark had it all. Money, fame, women, you name it, he had it, or he could buy it. Even after his adventure in a Middle Eastern cave, he still had it all. He hadn't lost the empire built in his last name. He very easily could have simply gone back to the life he had known before. That almost certainly would have been the easiest choice, diving back into the lap of luxury after weeks of mental and physical anguish. Instead, Tony allowed that experience to change him and rejected his old life. Rather than continue to make himself rich, he chose to enrich himself, to take the power of his mind and the endless possibilities enabled by his great wealth, and to put them into the service of others. Power is not inherently evil. It all comes down to how you use it. However, it's important to remember that the love of power is evil. I don't mean merely the desire to hold some authority. That can be good if your intentions are pure and you desire to use your influence in the service of others, but the love of power for its own sake is absolutely condemnable. For an example of this in recent media, I'm sure you won't be at all surprised that I will now talk about the Barbie movie. Particularly the end of the movie, after the Great Ken Revolt has been put down and the two sects of Barbies decide they can live more or less in harmony.
Please may the Kens have one Supreme Court justice.
Oh, I can't do that. But maybe a lower circuit court judgeship.
So you're probably expecting me to skewer the Barbies for being misandrous, but let me subvert those expectations and go after the Kens first. Why exactly do you need a seat on the Supreme Court? Why does it matter that there's a dude along with 8 chicks? I mean, they literally just said that things won't go back to the way they were.
No Barbie or Ken should be living in the shadows.
With the Kens being, homeless. So it's not as if the Kens even really need an advocate. They just want someone with their, face shape to be on the Supreme Court because, well, it's only fair, right? And the fact that this is a fake court in a fake world, which doesn't actually do anything, simply goes further to emphasize the fact that it does not matter. We should absolutely not care about the gender of the person in power, as long as they're doing a good job. And if they are doing a bad job, which most of them are, assuming that everything will just be fixed if we swap them out for someone of the opposite sex is short-sighted and moronic. Power is corruptive. It doesn't care about your gender, race, or your favorite flavor of ice cream. It will grab hold of you and make you a narcissistic monster if you're not careful. But of course, the real reason for the Ken's request is so the narrator could drop this gem.
One day, the Kens will have as much power and influence in Barbie Land as women have in the real world.
There you have it. That is what Hollywood values. Power and influence. Truly a mask-off moment. If we're being generous and actually asking why Hollywood desires power for women so very much, we might ask the question, can we say with any amount of certainty that women's social, financial, and mental health problems would be solved if those who shared their gender were largely in charge of our governments? No. Obviously not. You want to know how I know that? Because men are now, and pretty much always have been, in charge. Even today, less than 30% of the House and the Senate in the US are women. And men still have issues. Lots of them. The rich and powerful don't tend to serve those whom they supposedly represent, even their own gender. They serve themselves. They build the system not to suit their sex, but rather people like them in terms of wealth and status. Men, women, Wookiees, whatever, give them authority and they will use it for their own gain. I'm sorry. That was unfair of me. Wookiees are far better than that. Let's say Neimoidians. You can always rely on a Neimoidian to be a corrupt scumbag. All this to say, we should be extremely suspicious of anyone who seeks power. Their intentions are likely far from selfless, and they don't understand the corrupt nature of the thing they pursue. In Hollywood, this dubious pursuit of power has most notably manifested itself in the rejection of love in favor of what they would call autonomy. Do you remember this interview?
I just mean that it's no longer 1937.
I'm sure you do. If you're watching this video, I can only assume you're terminally online and can't recall the touch of grass. Well, let it never be said that I am late to the party.
A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.
I feel kind of bad for Rachel Ziegler, honestly. Yeah, the things she says here aren't great, but how many actresses in Hollywood wouldn't say the exact same thing? She's quite obviously reading from a script. That's what they all do for a living. For crying out loud, Gal Gadot, who no one seems to have really gone after for this, chimed in with,
That is
not going to be saved by the prince.
She's not going to be saved.
Hollywood is one big hive mind, clearly. But concerning the story at hand, let's get one thing out of the way. The prince in the original animated Snow White does basically nothing. He's barely a character. He just shows up and kisses Snow White. Woohoo. He's no Prince Philip, is all I'm saying. And even Philip needed some serious fairy magic assistance to take down Maleficent. He just had to find within himself the courage to face down a dragon. We'll come back to Maleficent later, by the way. The point being, the original is a masterpiece simply due to its revolutionary nature, but let's not pretend the characterization in it is perfect not to be touched. But I think it's safe to say that the way they changed the story and the characters won't sit well with audiences. And more importantly, the changes fly in the face of the foundational moral truths that the pursuit of power is evil and the pursuit of love is good. Returning to this interview,
And she's not going to be dreaming about true love. She's dreaming about becoming the leader she knows she can be.
note how the idea of dreaming of true love and the idea of becoming the leader she knows she can be are set at odds. Is this the choice we want to present to young girls? You can either find a boy and fall in love, or you can be a girl boss who just needs herself. Really? Is that what we're going with? I can hardly think of a better example to highlight Hollywood's absolute moral bankruptcy. The love of human beings for one another has been the foundation of society forever. It's how we find happiness and meaning. It's how we reproduce and pass on our knowledge to future generations. It's the most essential aspect of life. But nah, I'm gonna be a leader. I'm gonna have power. Having to tie myself to some man would only hold me back. Does that sound heroic to you? Is power what heroes seek? Well, to answer that question, let's briefly examine two of the greatest heroic epics from the 20th century. There are multiple moments throughout The Lord of the Rings in which characters encounter the One Ring and find themselves tempted by the power its bearer could wield. Galadriel, whom Frodo freely offers the ring, projects a vision of how she could use the ring for good, and yet she refuses its allure. Gandalf likewise rejects the ring, acknowledging that over me the ring would gain a power still greater and more deadly. The way of the ring to my heart is by pity for weakness and the desire of strength to do good. And of course, the chief hero of the story refused to be enthralled by the One Ring's temptation, by its vision of all of Mordor as one massive garden. The one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due, not a garden swollen to a realm, his own hands to use, not the hands of others to command. Power is corrupting. Those who cling to it cling only to their own demise. This truth could hardly be more clearly displayed than in the culmination of Luke Skywalker's journey. With the fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance, he refuses power. He literally throws it away. And he trusts in love, because that's what heroes do. Compare that to the end of
Somehow Palpatine returned.
or whatever that movie is supposed to be called.
I am all the Sith.
I'm all the Jedi.
Okay. Oh, look, now she has two lightsabers. Now she can push hard enough so that Palpatine loses. How fun. What a good Star Wars. I can hardly think of a better moment to demonstrate Disney Star Wars. It looks like Star Wars, but it doesn't feel like Star Wars. It's got the glowing lights and the colorful costumes, but it's devoid of the meaning of the original trilogy and even of the prequels. Rey just kind of does things. She's not annoyingly arrogant or even power-hungry herself. She's just blank. Her journey has so little actual characterization to it. It's just hollow, shapeless, and pointless. This is what happens when you don't plan out your trilogy. It's also symptomatic of the extremely ambiguous morality pervasive in Hollywood these days. That doesn't like to say a lot about the differences between heroes and villains. Many modern Hollywood villains are written as far more sympathetic than they really should be, due to their status as a victim, because our modern world loves victims. We all want to be victims so that we can grab power and leading roles and call it establishing fairness and equity. When you divide the world into oppressors and oppressed, you tend to give far too much moral leeway to those who have been victimized, sometimes to the point that you don't even cast them as villains. Wanda Maximoff is a great example of this. She lost the love of her life due to Thanos, and then enslaved an entire town in order to regain what she had lost. But at the end of this story, she's treated with nothing but sympathy.
They'll never know what you sacrificed for them.
She sacrificed a delusion to give hundreds of people back their free will. That's not exactly heroic or praiseworthy. It's just a return to a base level of human decency after doing some truly horrific things. And of course, it's no accident that women are the ones Hollywood largely treats in this overly sympathetic fashion. The industry hive mind believes women to have been largely and unfairly ignored in cinematic history and in these unbelievably successful franchises, so they go to great lengths to force them to succeed, which of course often leads to the audiences not liking the female characters because the creative team was far too focused on what they wanted rather than what the fans wanted, which was of course just a good freaking story. Hollywood in this way does a real disservice to women because it simply does not write them with the same level of care and attention it gives to its male heroes. Say what you will about the Barbie movie, and I have, but you have to acknowledge that it succeeded where so many other properties had failed, or at least had been torched by the fans after the fact, because it was actually made for its audience. Greta Gerwig didn't fall into the trap of seeing a wildly successful IP enjoyed by a majority male fanbase and screech in jealousy. She simply made a movie she knew would resonate with women like her. And honestly, with a lot of women not like her. I know women who are not remotely politically aligned with Ms. Gerwig who still very much enjoyed the movie. The male and female perspectives are just different. A man and a woman can be in agreement on every social issue imaginable and still come out with wildly different opinions of that or any other film. But I'm getting off topic. Returning to the conversation of victim status, I have to mention Blue Eye Samurai, which actually gets it right of all things these days. I've made a whole video on Mizu already, so I'll just hit the main thematic point. Mizu's power, despite being awesome to the point of otherworldly at times, is not depicted as a good thing, as a defining trait that makes her a hero. Instead, her skill with the blade and her obsession with that skill ends up being a crucial piece in her downfall. The story knows that, despite being a victim, Mizu's actions in pursuit of revenge are not justifiable, and furthermore that they do not fulfill her, but rather are slowly destroying her. The audience is not supposed to be inspired by Mizu to hail her as a hero, but rather to mourn the loss of what could have been, what was, to look at her former happiness and wish that she were not as she is now. Contrast that with a rather forgotten show from the last few years, The Terminal List. Briefly summarized, this story follows a Navy SEAL whose entire team, save for himself and his wife and daughter, were murdered due to a government/corporate conspiracy. James Reese, the show's protagonist and supposed hero, embarks on a quest to unmask and execute the conspirators, and he does so quite successfully. In the process, he guns down quite a few other individuals, including various guards or contractors who are protecting his targets. And in the show's final scene, he shoots his former friend in cold blood, having discovered that the man was part of the plot, and despite the fact that Ben was quite remorseful at his involvement. This is not a hero. This is an anti-hero. But the show doesn't want you to believe that. It wants you to view this American patriot as an unqualified good guy. Clearly, this show was made by people of the opposite political persuasion as most of Hollywood. But they fell into a similar morality trap just on the other side of the horseshoe. Instead of saying, "You've been a victim, therefore you can do whatever you want to seize power," they said, "You're the good guy, fighting against the bad guys, so as long as you don't explicitly murder innocent civilians or other good guys, we should be fine." They even throw in this line about the Secretary of Defense's government agents being swapped out with private contractors.
She's just dumb CID too.
For who, Secret Service?
Talos. Contracts out for a dozen men, maybe more.
Because we can't have the American veteran gunning down American law enforcement. As if private security contractors aren't largely veterans and former cops anyway. Instead of oppressor versus oppressed, where the victims are always right, Terminal List takes a good guy versus bad guy approach, where of course the morally good guy is always justified and doesn't feel any remorse, regret, or shame after his killing spree that probably filled up a half-dozen orphanages. Instead of morally gray, everything is classified in stark black and white with no crossover or complexity. It's a somewhat understandable reaction to the state of modern Hollywood, but it is still a reaction and not one that was particularly well thought out. If you're going to showcase a hero that rejects the murky morality in which modern screenwriters love to hide, you're gonna need to do better than that. You need to write characters who understand that the power they wield can and will corrupt them, even if their cause is just. And that belief of moral ambiguity absolutely exists within Hollywood's hive mind, often alongside subversion of established characters who were very much good or evil. Maleficent wasn't so bad, they suggest. She was abused, poor thing. Can you really blame her? Yes. Her name means evil. She calls on all the powers of hell! She's as despicable as they come. Who thought this movie was a good idea? And of course they did it again. Oh, poor Cruella de Vil. Her mother tried to have her killed as a baby. Don't you feel sorry for her? No. Our latest example comes from our dear friends at The Acolyte.
It's why I've kind of stopped using the word villain, because I feel like people look at a villain as like a surface level, like bad person, whereas if I say antagonist, at least that implies depth and that we'll get some justifications for why they've done what they've done.
Okay. First off,
get out!
Second, where did this absurd notion come from that villains don't have depth unless they can be cast as antagonists who have justifications for their actions? And of course, the things that these base level villains want are power and influence. Where have I heard that before? Pay attention to the wording there. The interviewer said justification, not excuse, not explanation, not motivation. Any of those words would have worked, but she said justifications. That implies that a villain, antagonist, is justified in acting as they do, which is of course ridiculous, because if they were justified, they would be the hero. Unless, of course, the story you want to tell isn't so much about good and evil, but rather about subverting the themes of a classic story.
But if you can't look and see that Anakin blowing up the Death Star possibly killed millions and millions of people, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this.
We're going to ignore Charlie Barnett pulling a Ross at his own wedding because everyone and their dog has already dunked on him for that. So instead, let's weigh the options presented to Anakin in his X-Wing. A, let the Empire continue to blow up any planet they want, or B, stop them. Would it be wrong, according to these people, to drop a bomb on an enemy aircraft carrier? A lot of people work on those things too. Sure, it's less than the Death Star, but that doesn't really matter. If destroying an enemy vessel that has non-combatants on it like cooks and janitors is wrong, then it's wrong, no matter how big the ship is. The reality is, of course, that there's no moral complexity here. Luke was absolutely in the right. It's absurd to suggest that attacking your enemy, whose mission is the domination of the entire galaxy, is wrong just because they have a lot of people fighting on their side. Trying to murk up the morality of Star Wars is absurd, postmodern nonsense. But I suppose I have wandered off the topic of the lust for power and into the realm of Hollywood's general moral bankruptcy and relativism. But that matters, because the latter naturally leads to the former. See, when you have generally removed the idea of objective good and evil, all you have left is what you want and what other people want. In order to achieve your desires, and maybe the desires of the people you care about, you need power. You need the ability to change and influence. If other people, those who don't want what you want, have power, then you are at risk of not attaining your oh-so-precious wants, which of course you classify as needs. This is why Hollywood is so obsessed with power, because it is the only way to assure the achievement of the selfish hedonistic lifestyle that is one's ultimate good when one falls into moral relativism. And since, in their view, women have been the victims, have been so long held back from having the things their hearts desired most, it is the women's turn to grab that power. Let me simply re-emphasize an earlier point. Power is not evil. The love of power is, because wanting power means wanting your own way. It means pursuing the ability to have whatever you want, whenever you want it, certain that doing so will make you happy. That is a lie. Power will not make you happy. Love will. And your freely and unconditionally given love will bring great, true, deep, and lasting joy to others. So Hollywood, if you're somehow watching this, first off, congratulations, you finally did something worthwhile. Second, heroes seek love, not power, or agency, or freedom from responsibilities. With great power, after all. Your heroes, our heroes, cannot be these self-obsessed, empty husks who only exist to show how powerful and competent they are, to pursue power leadership instead of love. Instead, they must be men and women of virtue who carry a great weight due to the power that they wield, and who fight not for their own interests, but for the love of others.